On October 3, 1943, at roughly 30,000 feet above the North Sea, a waist gunner inside an American bomber braced his face against the cold housing of a .50 caliber Browning. Ahead of him, a German fighter, closing from the side at high speed, cut across the bomber formation. The aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, was approaching from a perfect angle for a deflection attack. The gunner could make out the black crosses on its wings and the flashes from its guns as it began firing. Every instinct told him to track the fighter directly and fire straight at it. Instead, he did the opposite. He aimed well behind the aircraft, several plane lengths back, and opened fire into the empty air between the attacker and his own bomber's tail. Seconds later, the fighter flew into the stream of bullets and erupted in flames. The shot looked wrong, but it worked. What he had applied was a technique later known as position firing. For gunners shooting from a moving bomber at a fast-approaching fighter, aiming directly at the target almost always resulted in a miss. The correct approach required firing at a fixed point in space where the fighter would pass through. This method, though counterintuitive, turned American aerial gunners from inexperienced shooters into disciplined specialists capable of defending bombers with surprising effectiveness. The discovery of this principle, however, began years earlier in the Nevada desert. In January 1941, outside Las Vegas, an Army Air Corps officer surveyed a vast stretch of barren land, tens of thousands of acres of scrub brush, sand, and open sky. This empty terrain was chosen to become the United States' first dedicated aerial gunnery training center. Strategic bombing campaign would fail. Aircraft such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator carried numerous 50 caliber machine guns for protection, but those weapons were useless without proper training. The British experience underscored the danger. Early in the war, Royal Air Force bomber crews suffered heavy losses when their gunners, trained mainly on ground targets, attempted to fire directly at attacking fighters. Their natural instincts led to missed shots and fatal consequences. Determined to avoid the same outcome, the U.S. Army Air Corps leased about 60,000 acres of desert land from the city of Las Vegas for a symbolic fee. Construction began in early 1941. Within months, the site contained barracks, classrooms, hangars, and firing ranges. By mid-June, more than 100 instructors had arrived, tasked with developing methods to teach a form of combat that few fully understood. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, urgency intensified. Orders were issued to begin aerial gunnery training immediately. The base was activated later that month, and students soon started arriving. The United States, now at war, needed trained gunners as quickly as possible. Training initially took place on the ground. Instructors mounted shotguns on fixed stands that allowed only limited movement. Trainees practiced by firing at clay targets launched into the air at various angles. These exercises were designed to teach lead, timing, and tracking, skills that would later be adapted to machine guns aboard bombers. From these early experiments in the Nevada desert emerged the techniques that would redefine how American air crews defended themselves in the skies of World War II. The concept behind the training was logical. Trainees practiced intercept shooting, the same principle hunters had relied on for generations. If a bird crosses your field of view, you don't fire at it directly. You aim ahead so that the projectile and the target reach the same point at the same moment. The idea felt straightforward and rooted in common sense. Everything shifted once the instructors introduced motion to the shooters themselves. Shotguns were mounted on the backs of moving trucks that rolled across the desert. Suddenly, shots that should have been simple became nearly impossible. Clay targets drifted by untouched. Students followed their training, aiming ahead of the targets just as they had been taught, yet they consistently missed. Confusion spread quickly. The trainees weren't doing anything differently, so why were the results so poor? The explanation rested on a physical principle that ran counter to intuition. When a stationary shooter fires at a moving object, the solution is to lead the target. But when both the shooter and the target are in motion, the geometry changes entirely. An instructor with a physics background demonstrated this with a diagram: a bomber traveling at 300 miles per hour, a fighter approaching from the side at a similar speed, and a bullet fired from the bomber. Most students assumed the bullet would travel in a straight line from the gun toward the point of aim. In reality, the projectile retained the forward speed of the aircraft the instant it left the barrel. Every round fired from the bomber was already moving forward at the bomber's velocity, in addition to the speed imparted by the gun. Because of this, a bullet fired sideways didn't move purely sideways. Pendulum, a weight on a string, walking forward while the weight swung, showed that motion affected its position. When released, the weight didn't fall straight down. It continued forward. Bullets behaved in the same way. The consequences for combat were significant. If an enemy fighter approached from directly abeam and a gunner aimed straight at it, the bullet would travel ahead of the target and miss. The bomber's own speed ensured failure. To land a hit on a fighter positioned to the side, the gunner actually needed to aim behind it, sometimes far behind. The precise adjustment depended on speed, distance, and angle, but the underlying rule remained consistent, even though it contradicted instinct. British crews first identified this through hard experience in aerial battles over Europe. They organized the defensive space around a bomber into zones, each requiring a different aiming method. American forces later expanded on this system and introduced what became known as position firing. This approach relied on understanding how attacking fighters maneuvered. Because their guns were fixed forward, fighters had to fly curved pursuit paths to keep their weapons trained on the bomber. To the gunner, the attacking aircraft appeared to slide sideways toward the tail, while also growing larger as it closed in. This predictable geometry allowed for calculation. The angle between the fighter and the bomber, combined with both aircraft speeds and the bullet's velocity, determined the correct point of aim. Training materials included charts, tables, and simplified rules based on angular measurement. Every instinct from hunting or target practice suggested that such an aim was wrong, but physics proved otherwise. By mid-1942, training programs had become highly structured. Facilities like the Las Vegas Army Airfield were graduating hundreds of aerial gunners in rapid cycles. The 6-week curriculum began with classroom instruction on ballistics, aircraft identification, and the mechanics of the .50 caliber machine gun. Trainees learned to disassemble and reassemble their weapons without sight, preparing for the cramped, freezing, and vibrating conditions they would face in flight. Over time, the program systematically replaced natural shooting instincts with the calculated methods required for combat in moving aircraft. During the second week of training, recruits moved on to exercises using shotgun trucks. They spent long hours firing at clay targets while standing on moving platforms, gradually becoming accustomed to shooting accurately while in motion. As their skills improved, instructors increased the speed of the trucks, forcing the trainees to lead their targets more and more, adjusting their aim behind the moving discs to account for motion. By the third week, attention shifted to mechanical tracking simulators. Tall towers, ranging from about 10 to 40 feet, were arranged to resemble a bomber formation. From mock gun positions mounted on these towers, students tracked model fighter aircraft that were pulled across the sky on cables. No live ammunition was used at this stage. The goal was to build muscle memory and precision in keeping a gun sight aligned with a moving target while compensating for the motion of their own aircraft. Recreate nearly any attack scenario, allowing students to review their performance immediately, identify errors, and repeat the exercise until their accuracy improved. Week 5 brought live air-to-air firing. Trainees boarded real B-17 and B-24 bombers and took positions at waist guns and turrets. They fired at fabric sleeves towed behind other aircraft. Ammunition was color-coded, so instructors could evaluate each gunner's performance after landing by counting impacts on the targets. Feedback was given right away. The sixth and final week combined advanced firing drills with examinations. Students practiced defensive procedures against multi-angle attacks and demonstrated competence at all gun positions. About 1 in 5 failed to complete the program. Those who passed received silver gunner wings and were assigned to operational bomber crews. By July 7, 1943, 7 gunnery schools across the United States had produced nearly 20,000 trained gunners. By the end of that year, the total exceeded 57,000. At peak output, the Las Vegas school alone graduated roughly 600 men every 5 weeks. Training capacity was immense, but its true value would be tested in combat over Europe. On August 17, 1943, at 27,000 feet above Germany, 376 B-17 bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force set course for targets deep within the Reich, ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft plants at Regensburg. The mission aimed to cripple German fighter production. German defenses responded in force. More than 400 fighters, single-engine and twin-engine types, some armed with rockets, rose to intercept. They employed tactics designed to exploit weaknesses in bomber defenses, including head-on assaults from high frontal positions and attacks from below where firing arcs were limited. Losses of that magnitude led many to conclude that daylight bombing without fighter escort could not continue, yet the defending gunners also inflicted damage. Instead of only a handful of enemy aircraft, they shot down roughly 27 German fighters, far fewer than early combat claims, but still significant. Their success was largely due to the position firing methods drilled into them during training. Gunners applied calculated deflection rather than aiming directly at incoming fighters. For example, when a fighter approached from the side at medium range, they aimed behind the target by a specific angular offset, fired in short bursts, and observed the results. The technique worked as predicted by ballistics and geometry. However, many gunners reported that their instinct was always to aim straight at the enemy. Only repeated training enabled them to override that impulse under combat pressure. The Schweinfurt mission provided lessons for both sides. German pilots discovered that tightly grouped bombers with well-trained gunners were far more dangerous than anticipated. American commanders recognized that even effective gunnery could not compensate for the absence of fighter escort. Still, the training program itself was validated. When gunners applied proper deflection, they could hit fast-moving fighters in complex aerial engagements. Efforts then turned to improving accuracy even further. Inspiration came from Britain, where in late 1943, Royal Air Force night fighters began using a new gyroscopic gun sight known as the Mk2. This device used gyroscopes and optical systems to calculate the correct lead automatically. Pilots only needed to keep the reticle on the target. The sight handled the rest. The guns were pointing, and another controlled by a gyro, showing where the bullets would travel after accounting for motion, angle, and basic ballistics. When no deflection was needed, the two marks aligned. During tracking, the moving reticle shifted to indicate the correct aiming point. Installing these sights in bomber turrets, however, posed difficulties. The equipment was bulky and required the gunner to estimate range by setting the enemy aircraft's wingspan. In the chaos of combat, often with multiple attackers approaching simultaneously, adjusting these controls could be challenging. Even so, the technology represented a major step toward improving aerial gunnery accuracy. Despite their limitations, gyro-assisted gun sights marked a major leap forward. Trials in early 1944 revealed that gunners equipped with these systems were scoring roughly twice as many hits as those relying on traditional ring and bead sights, even when both groups understood proper firing positions. By calculating deflection automatically, the new devices freed gunners from having to recall angular tables and radian charts in the middle of combat. As the summer of 1944 arrived, many American bombers were fitted with compensating sights. These mechanisms used information such as turret angle, aircraft speed, and altitude to determine lead, though they were less complex than full gyro units. Their simplicity made them practical under combat pressure. Once a gunner set the aircraft's speed and altitude, tracking the target was all that remained, while the sight continuously corrected the aiming point. The impact was striking. Crews trained in modern firing techniques and equipped with improved sights were suddenly able to destroy attacking fighters from distances and angles once thought unrealistic. By late 1944, the Army Air Forces had overhauled their training program, using lessons from 2 years of combat. The standard 6-week course now covered additional subjects: fire control discipline to prevent friendly fire incidents, recognition of German attack patterns, and procedures for dealing with weapon jams, damaged turrets, or wounded crewmates. One training concept drew particular attention: Operation Pinball. At the Las Vegas Army Airfield, 7 modified Bell RP-63 King Cobra fighters were converted into armored training aircraft nicknamed Pinballs. Their exteriors were reinforced with thick duralumin plating. Trainees fired frangible rounds made of compressed lead powder and plastic that disintegrated on impact. Sensors installed in the aircraft triggered a bright red light in the propeller hub whenever a hit was registered, giving students immediate visual confirmation. Just as important, the pilots flew aggressive, realistic attack profiles that mirrored German and Japanese fighter tactics. Instead of shooting at predictable towed sleeves, trainees practiced against maneuvering aircraft, executing authentic dives and evasive moves. Results were impressive. Students who trained against pinballs achieved hit rates 30 to 40% higher in combat than those who had practiced only on towed targets. By early 1945, the program had spread to all Army Air Forces gunnery schools. Combat data offered further insight. As more bombers received improved sights and better trained crews, defensive fire became measurably more effective. Interceptors to face Allied fighters over their own territory. Even with these variables, the trend remained clear. Bombers staffed by well-trained gunners and equipped with modern sighting systems destroyed about twice as many attacking fighters as aircraft with inexperienced crews and basic sights. This improvement resulted from several factors: better instruction in firing geometry, more advanced equipment, refined tactics, and stricter fire discipline. At its heart, however, lay a lesson first demonstrated in the Nevada desert. Effective gunnery depended as much on training and tools as on courage. The Pacific Theater soon became another proving ground, where American crews adapted their methods to counter Japanese fighter tactics that differed markedly from those used in Europe. Japanese Zero and Oscar fighters prioritized agility over heavy protection or large-caliber weapons. Instead of relying on armor, their pilots exploited sharp dive angles, rapid turns, and close-range engagements, trusting maneuverability to slip past defensive fire. This forced American bomber crews to rethink how they aimed and fired from formation. By the final year of the Pacific War, the B-29 Superfortress introduced a major technological leap. Its defensive guns were not operated directly from exposed turrets. Instead, gunners worked inside pressurized sections of the aircraft, using periscopic sights linked to remote turrets and electronic fire control equipment. These systems calculated lead and deflection automatically, factoring in distance, angles, and the speeds of both aircraft. Veterans later described how the system worked in combat. Japanese interceptors often approached quickly from below, attempting to slip under bomber formations. Turrets rotated on their own, gun barrels adjusted elevation, and the gunner's task was reduced to keeping the sight steady and firing at the right moment. At such high speeds and awkward angles, manual estimation would have been nearly impossible. Automation made effective defense against fast fighters achievable. This centralized fire control network represented the peak development of position firing concepts. Human operators tracked and followed targets, while machines solved ballistic problems, lead angle, bullet drop, and even wind effects. Together, the system proved highly effective. By August 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces had trained more than 214,000 aerial gunners at 7 specialized schools. The Las Vegas facility alone produced over 44,000 of them before the end of 1944. Trainees learned to set aside instinct and rely on calculated firing solutions, allowing their aircraft's speed to help carry rounds into attacking fighters. Measuring the exact number of enemy aircraft destroyed is difficult. Claims were often exaggerated, with several gunners firing at the same target and each reporting a victory. Gun camera coverage was incomplete, especially on bombers, and many Axis records were lost in bombing or the turmoil of surrender. Even so, available evidence indicates that well-trained American gunners achieved roughly twice the confirmed success rate of untrained crews using identical weapons. Most of that improvement came from mastering position firing techniques. Underlying concept: a projectile fired from a moving platform carries that platform's velocity. To hit a moving opponent, pilots must consider their own motion as well as the target's. The Nevada desert that once held the Las Vegas Army Airfield is now Nellis Air Force Base, home to advanced training units and the Thunderbirds demonstration team. The original ranges have been replaced, yet the lessons discovered there in 1941 remain embedded in U.S. Air Combat Doctrine: if you are stationary, you lead a moving target. If you are moving, you adjust differently. Physics is indifferent to intuition. It rewards only what is accurate. German bomber gunnery never fully incorporated these position firing methods. Their instruction focused more on individual shooting skill and experience than on systematic, calculated solutions. Newly assigned gunners often picked up their skills by watching seasoned crew members and copying what worked, rather than through any formal curriculum. This improvised method functioned reasonably well while German bomber units still operated over areas where experienced crews survived long enough to pass on their knowledge. As casualties increased and veteran gunners were lost, however, that informal system collapsed and the defensive strength of German bombers weakened noticeably. Japan encountered comparable problems. Instruction for aerial gunners remained scattered and largely unofficial. While some individuals understood ideas related to firing from a moving aircraft and leading targets, these ideas never developed into an organized training doctrine. The Royal Air Force turned increasingly to nighttime operations, where visibility was limited and success relied more on electronic countermeasures, navigation technology, and fighter protection than on precise visual shooting. Although certain aircraft experimented with gyro-stabilized sights and radar-assisted tail turrets, the British never built the large, standardized training system that became a hallmark of the United States. Only the United States successfully merged structured instruction in position-based firing with advanced targeting devices and mass training of personnel. This integration produced bomber crews capable of defending themselves even when escorts were unavailable, though fighter cover remained highly desirable. The shift from instinctive shooting to calculated aiming marked a major change in how people learned combat skills. For millennia, hunters and soldiers relied on direct aiming or simple leading of moving targets, methods that were intuitive and easy to teach. High-speed air combat made those habits obsolete. Aircraft moved too fast, engagement angles shifted constantly, and the physics involved defied common sense. Trainees had to abandon natural instincts and accept mathematical solutions. They learned, for example, that firing well behind an approaching fighter could still result in a hit once relative motion was accounted for. An idea that ran counter to everything they had previously structured. Exercises and repetition, these programs reshaped reflexes that had developed over human history. The real achievement of American gunnery schools was not just their facilities or equipment, but their success in retraining the human mind to rely on calculation instead of instinct. Education. The terminology and hardware have evolved dramatically, yet the core physics remain the same. A projectile launched from a moving aircraft carries that aircraft's speed and direction. Effective aiming requires accounting for one's own motion as well as the target's. By the end of the Second World War, the United States had created what was arguably the most effective aerial gunnery training system ever assembled, producing crews capable of resisting determined fighter attacks with calculated precision. The rise in effectiveness was driven by grasping a paradox that ran against common sense. When enemy fighters burst into view at high speed, closing from the side at hundreds of miles per hour, experienced gunners did not track the aircraft directly. Nor did they try to lead them in the usual way. Instead, they aimed slightly behind the attacking plane, relying on the forward motion of their own bomber to carry the stream of bullets into the interceptor's future path. To do this correctly, they had to suppress instinct and follow calculations that felt unnatural but proved accurate. Formal training programs for these techniques ended in September 1945 as the war concluded and the military began to stand down. Facilities in the Las Vegas area were reassigned and eventually became part of what is now Nellis Air Force Base. Instructors returned to civilian life, taking with them the rare expertise required to teach a skill that seemed almost impossible at first. Former students scattered across the United States, their wartime training leaving a lasting mark. Even after the schools closed, the core lesson endured. Careful calculation can outperform reflex. With enough repetition and discipline, training can reshape the mind so that complex adjustments happen almost automatically. Bomber gunners learn to factor in their own aircraft's motion, to fire behind rather than at the target, and to trust the math that predicted where the two paths would intersect. Their mastery of this counterintuitive approach contributed to success in the most destructive conflict in modern history. The development of position firing illustrates how adaptable people can be when guided by structured training. It shows how individuals can acquire skills that contradict natural reactions and still perform them under extreme pressure. While grounded in physics and ballistics, the story is also about confidence. Confidence in instructors who insisted on techniques that felt backward, in equipment designed to assist calculation, and in drills that overrode deeply rooted instincts. These methods were tested in combat over Europe and the Pacific, where properly trained gunners were able to repel attackers that might otherwise have destroyed their crews. Understanding deflection and motion became a matter of life and death. The Nevada desert, where this transformation began, is now home to some of the world's most advanced aviation training. Modern demonstrations and tactics would have seemed unimaginable in the early 1940s, yet the underlying principle remains unchanged. Movement alters trajectories, speed reshapes outcomes, and sometimes accuracy requires aiming at empty space so that physics can bring projectile and target together later. Firing, though counterintuitive, proved that truth in combat and helped save countless lives.